The history of Chinatown in Oroville is grossly under-recorded and provided to the public. I mean, really grossly. When I started researching this about 6 months, Darlene Gee, who is here, and these are members of the Gee, we'll talk about it in a second though. Anyway, she contacted me and I decided to start researching Chinatown. I'd been here in 1985. I went to the temple. I came up from Livermore where I was with a historical society. I saw a 3-block long street and everybody said there were 10,000 Chinese in Oroville. And I'm going, no, that can't be in 3 blocks. Anyway, when this came up, when we started talking with the Gee family, and Darlene's helped me a lot, I realized one of the things that came out is they've just rezoned the open land on Broderick Street. It was zoned as recreational. It's been that way since the 1940s. There's someone interested in buying all that land up and putting businesses in there. So the city council or the planning commission just authorized rezoning it so they could sell it off. So it really drove home that the story of Oroville's Chinatown is not very well told. The Chinese temple brings in a lot of people. I went there in '85. I've been there half a dozen times. It's an absolutely great building. It's a great experience going through the temple if you haven't done it. I strongly recommend you do it. But even the few buildings that are left, most people don't know what they were. So with that, first though, what I want to do, I think, we have a large contingency of Gee family members and relatives of Fong Li. There's 21 people here from those families that have come to hear this. Now, this puts me in a risky spot because there's some things they know far more about than I do. But anyway, I think I have some information that'll help you. Fong Li was in the 1870s within the lava beds. We'll talk about that. He had a store there, and he has a store on Broderick Street. It's still standing. And Guianglong Gee had a store in 1901 to 1933. And we'll talk about them a little at the appropriate time because we're kind of going to go in chronological order, okay? I had done, in 2011, I did a year researching the California Indians. The process I use is the same process I used for this. I went through all the newspapers from 1850 to today, and I started gathering up articles about the California Indians, especially in Butte County and Northern California. A couple of things became very apparent to me after I did that research, and the same thing exists with this. I had 800 or 900 newspaper articles, but they're all told from one perspective. And so what you have is a very unbalanced approach to the history of the Indians because it's told from one perspective only. You know, you can talk about buildings and you can talk about even a history of a town per se, but when you start talking about cultures, that does not work to focus on just one culture and not the other culture that's involved in that interaction. So these are the rules that drove me in how I'm presenting this today, okay? So we are going to talk a little bit about Oroville's history, and we will also talk about Chinatown. There's a very unique, Oroville's history with the Chinese is extremely unique because there was as many Chinese in this area as there were people in Oroville who created the town. So from the get-go, there was almost an equal balance because they were mining. And so that's kind of unique. So the town gets created, and later Chinatown gets created, and the businessmen in Oroville started investing in Chinatown. So there's a relationship that got formed that's kind of unique to California history. Okay? First thing to clear up some misconceptions. Everybody's heard of the Food and Drug Administration that was formed in 1906. Now we think of it as this big organization, and they do all this testing, and they authorized all this stuff. That's not why they were formed. In 1906, the William Randolph Hearst and all the newspapers were pushing patent medicines. And notice, this is an 1860s patent medicine that was sold in New York in the drugstores. They wanted to control it because you did not have to be a doctor. You did not have to be anything. You could just say, I've got this new product and it's going to cure cancer and lung disease and da-da-da-da-da, and there was no regulation at all. It was the Wild West up until 1913. Okay? Most people don't know that. I used to collect this stuff. That's why I know it. But anyway, this one's really interesting. Mrs. Winslow Soothing Syrup. It was for babies. They used to sell they had trade cards you could get for free in the drugstore. Okay? This had a narcotic in it. Let me show you this. These are 1860 bottles. This is the opium, and this is Mrs. Winslow's. The way you use this, if your baby cried a lot, you'd uncork it, put some on your finger, and rub it on your baby's gums, and they would go to sleep. Yeah. So understand, it was the wild, wild west as far as what you could claim. And everybody claimed they cured everything. And you had to have no degree, nothing to do that. In 1880, a gentleman by the name of Warner created his safe remedies. He owned a safe company. So he embossed a safe on his remedies, and he started selling safe remedies. He made $10 million in the 1880s selling this for $1 a bottle. So there's a stereotype kind of that's associated with other cultures that happens when you only hear one side of it. But when you learn the truth, everybody was doing it. Because remember, the reason you came to California in the gold rush was to make money. You didn't come here to build a town. You didn't come here. You came here to make money. You usually came without your family. So it was basically a male-dominated population. And their sole goal was to make money. So in some ways, all the cultures that came in at that time were basically starting at the same level and had the same goals. That changed over time. This is the first map that was done of this area. This is the Oregon Trail. If you were coming from Oregon down through here, you came this way. This is all agricultural land. What happened was when the gold rush broke out, you went this way. And notice there's nothing up there. This was Bidwell Park. We'll show that in a minute. And this is where Oroville is. It was called Ophir then. So you came up, and up until 1864, you had to catch a horse or a wagon or a ride from somebody or walk from Marysville to here, because all the ferries stopped in Marysville because that's as far as they could navigate north. Marysville was proclaiming at the time they were going to be the next San Francisco of Northern California because all freight stopped in Marysville. Now that ended up changing, okay? But anyway, so as you can see, there's no infrastructure in here. There's no police. There's no nothing. In Central California and Southern California, they had the mission systems. They had been habited for a long time, since the 1820s, I think it was, or 1870s, I guess. 1770s. They had been inhabited for a long time, and there was infrastructure. You came up here, and you wanted to know where to go. You went and tried to get a map, and this is the first map that was created for up here. Understand, in 1849, 1850, 1,750 people were hitting San Francisco a week. to try to go to the gold fields, okay? What happened was, like I said, you could come up to here by ferry or by riverboat. What happened was, Yuba City, Marysville, Sacramento, Stockton, all developed newspapers very early on. When the riverboats came up and dropped off people, they'd collect the newspapers and go back to San Francisco. So in 2 weeks in San Francisco, you would have newspapers that talked about what was happening up here. This was the first social media, if you will, of the time. And that's why you could disperse 1,750 people as fast as they could. Because at that time, it was $40 for a lunch in San Francisco. Okay, the population was about 15,000, I think, then. So anyway, that's how they managed to disperse all these people. What they tried to do early on was they picked out a justice of the peace for certain areas. And really, he was everything. He was the recorder for mining claims. He was supposedly the law enforcement, although they didn't usually do that, because it's one guy against a whole bunch of people. But so that was it. You know, there wasn't much up here. You know, this is a classic look at that's used at the gold mining community. This, I would argue, is a store. Someone up here built a log cabin, went to Marysville, brought up supplies, and started selling it to the miners. And that's how originally they got goods up here. It was in small quantities, and someone took the initiative to go back to Marysville and do that. Now, I'll also mention that it was not uncommon to have, we'll say, whites here, maybe Chinese around the bend, because they kind of stayed separate, and Indians, some Indians working around beyond that on the river. They kept separate, all of them, to avoid clashes. But they were all in the same area trying to make money. You know, the Indians figured out real fast that gold was worth money once it got going. Okay, let's talk about the Chinese immigration. Chinese immigration was relatively small until 1852. There was about 1,000 Chinese in California in 1851, okay? Because most of the Chinese came from, I think it's referred to as Canton, it's the Guangdong province, which is opposite Hong Kong. That was a very, very poor area, okay? You had to finance, and you had to go to Hong Kong to come up here, and Hong Kong was a British port at the time. So you had to get the British, pay the British to bring you up here with a ship, on a steamship. So not everybody could afford to do that. What started to change in 1852, all of a sudden 20,000 Chinese immigrated to California. The reason for that was that basically what they did was they looked for sponsors to pay their way. And in exchange, they would give them part of what they earned to repay the debt. Now, mining was a very labor-intensive, in 1852, very labor-intensive. So, you know, you could come in and be a strong male, and they'd say, okay, you obviously are going to be a miner, you can earn some money, we'll sponsor you, but you give us back a percentage of what you make. Now, stop and think. Women. Most women did not have a way of earning money. So the women that got sponsored were usually involved in the world's oldest profession, because they could demonstrate that they could make money and they could pay back the debt. So the immigration favored males more so than it did women. Very few Chinese came over with a family at that period. Okay? By 1852, there were stage lines established from Marysville to Oroville, or to Ophir. Actually, Ophir was the original name of Oroville. 1853, the Marysville newspaper reported there was a large immigration of Chinese hitting Marysville in the Yuba City area. They assumed they were going to mine the Yuba rivers and up down there, which there was. There was a lot of mining down there. They had a very rich mining area there. But some of them came up farther north. Basically, like I said before, they couldn't afford passage, so they're indebted to their sponsors. They showed up in Northern California in 1853. In 1855, I didn't put any of them up here. I did find mining claims filed by Chinese, and they signed their name in Chinese. So in 1855, they were up on the middle fork of the Feather River. Okay, now that happens to be what Bidwell Bar is, which we'll talk about in a minute. The Indian population at that time was like 1,200 in this area. Women were not counted in the census at that time. Blacks were not counted in the census at that time. And almost all mining at that point was still done this way. This happens to be a picture of a Chinese miner. By the way, I took the liberty of coloring a lot of these photographs because I think it makes it look nicer and it makes it more real and makes it warmer. So I have my own motives for that. Anyway, this is an 1877 map, but the reason, and some of the stuff you're seeing is on these walls as well. The reason I put it here is this is the first map that shows Oroville, the lava beds and rancheria, and the northern mining areas. And Bidwell Bar is over here. It's kind of off the map a little bit, I believe. Okay. In 1855, it was reported that down here in this area, now the lava beds was not called the lava beds until 1869 or something like that. This was called a rancheria, and a rancheria is a term for an old Indian village. In 1855, there was 1,000 Chinese in this area. Okay? Oroville did not grow into this area until after 1960. If you look at a 1960 map, this is all basically open land. Oroville grew this way when it grew. So anyway, but we're going to talk about a rancheria a little bit, and we're going to talk about the lava beds, and we're going to talk about Chinatown in this presentation. In 1855, Ophir, which had a population earlier of 400 people, had dropped to 200 people because people were no longer mining the river right around Ophir. They were going across the river and going north. And so the population actually dropped in 1854 in Oroville. This guy, Ralph Bird, who was a miner, laid out this map of the town of Oroville. Okay? That's Montgomery Street. Notice there's nothing past Montgomery Street. Partially, I think, because this area tended to flood. But anyway, so he laid out all this land. He bought all this land for $100. There was two trading posts. Donner had one, which this tract is named after, and it was down on Montgomery and about Donner Street right in here. And there's another one up on High Street by a man known as Judge Myers, and that's who Myers Street is named after. Those two trading posts were early trading posts in Ophir. When Bird bought this, he said, okay, if you sell me the stuff you have here, I'll lay out my map, divide up your lots, and you can sell them to make more money besides the $100. That's how he worked the deal. Okay? This is the main road into Oroville in 1854 after the post office was established in I guess it was in 54 it was established. This photo says 1854. I think it's actually 1856. This is the main street into Oroville. Okay, Chinatown would have been over here. This is the street that's right out here called Myers Street. This is a picture of in 1858 of downtown Oroville. It's actually called a letterhead. They used to sell paper so you could write letter sheets so you could write back to your family. They're called letter sheets, and they'd have an artist draw it up, and then you could write back to your family and say, I live in Oroville, and this is a shot of downtown. because people weren't taking pictures back then.
It was pretty well built up by that time.
When he did this map, this area here, which is downtown, this is Montgomery Street, this is the parking lot. Where am I here? Lot 2. The parking lot is now over here, across the street, on the other side of Montgomery Street. This area sold out in less than a year, okay? And the people who bought lots from Bird for 100 each subdivided their lots and sold them for 150 each. So the real estate was thriving in this area. Now, this area built out fast. It was a nucleus of downtown. This area took quite a while before it sold out. Right now, the railroad runs through here, High Street, okay? So it was wheeling and dealing and making money, however you could do it. In 1860, a map came out. I don't think this was ever actually adopted. This is only a portion of the map. Another map came out, and I don't believe it was adopted as an official map. Safford Street, which still exists today, was there. And the guy who made the map was called Henning. So he called what we call Broderick Street, he called it Henning Street after himself. And then this was Front Street down here. There was 3 attempts to make a ferry landing in Oroville to see if they could bring up goods by boat. And Marysville was adamantly against that because they did not want to lose their monopoly on the freight coming through Marysville. The boat got to right here. And in the papers it says the boat got to the very end of Chinatown and it couldn't go any farther. The Chinese had already started building a little bit of a levee here to try and avoid this area from flooding by that time. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this is there were people living in this area already, Chinese. There was no building codes, there was no control over that, because at the time they did their own thing and they could build buildings really fast. They replaced 50 buildings one time, I think, in a month and a half when they had a fire. Now, obviously, they weren't 2-story houses with balconies, but they could rebuild really quick, and they designed their own buildings too. Okay, but anyway, this is the first where you start to see the Chinatown area actually broken up and divided into lots. People up here said, there's a lot of Chinese down over here, down there, and they're slowly coming around, and they're starting to come into here. Maybe we should look at buying some of these lots and putting in buildings and sell them or rent them to the Chinese. So they built a number of brick buildings. And some of the early brick buildings in Chinatown were actually built by businessmen from up here. Okay. So already there was a relationship forming between the businessmen in Oroville and the Chinese businessmen, because they too had their own people who were selling general stores and stuff like that in that area. And there was actually quite a relationship between a couple of them. In 1856, a fire in Chinatown destroyed over 50 buildings. It was the first of many fires to be reported in Chinatown. At that time, all the buildings, with the exception of a few brick buildings, were made with wood. The Chinese Theater was built on Broderick Street in 1857, and they would have performances there that could last 2 or 3 days, plays and that kind of thing. This is interesting. The Chinese, in early 1850, a Chinese, well, I shouldn't say Chinese because it really wasn't written that way, a foreign miner's tax was established, and every miner had to buy a pass once a month for $4. Okay? So now they're paying back the people who brought them over, and they're paying Butte, well, it was all throughout the state, but Butte County a tax every month to be here. Okay? Notice this. 1 month he collected $5,000 in the Oroville area from Chinese in taxes. Do the math. And in 1855 or 1857 even, that was a lot of money. So now the tax is portrayed as something specific to the Chinese. Probably it was, just because the numbers were so much greater than the other foreign miners. But I would offer a different solution. There was no money in Butte County for a government. You know, you had all that building and selling that was done was by individual people. They built stores. The store owners, if you wanted to build another store in Oroville, you went to one of the other store owners to see if he would finance you and join in with you. The banks weren't doing that. They weren't doing speculative lending back there. So all the money that was being generated to build up Oroville was generated by the businessmen in downtown, okay? Now, that didn't necessarily help Butte County. Now, with this miner's tax, the deal was the county got half and the local municipality got half. So this was a way to finance the government in Butte County. That's actually what the motivation was. It wasn't to drive Chinese out of the area. It was to, how do I want to say that? I won't say fleece, but it was a way of getting money from the Chinese to help finance the development of downtown Oroville and stuff. That's why it was done, you know. So now you have another complicated relationship going on, where there's a lot of money coming in from the Chinese, and the businessmen are now involved with them. And all of a sudden, this relationship got established. And in Oroville, even in the 1880s, when the anti-Chinese movement came along, they weren't real excited about kicking the Chinese out because it was a cash cow for them, to be honest with you. And it helped them build the town, you know. And ironically, the initial improvements were sewage lines and stuff on Montgomery Street. None of it went to Chinatown. Chinatown stayed a dirt road for a long time, you know. Okay. In 1862, there were several floods that reached Montgomery Street. The water was 2 feet deep. As I said before, one of the reasons Montgomery Street was the last street that Byrd put on it was because that area started to dip down towards the water past that. So it was much more susceptible to flooding. If you really want to see, there's only one area, because there's a levee now in most of the river. If you go into Riverview Park at the end of Montgomery Street and go down and look at the water, that's the way all of Oroville and the riverbanks were. You could walk down to them. But like we experienced several years back, if you get a deluge of water, they can be under 2 feet of water. I think that's why Byrd initially did not put streets in there. However, he did own some of the land, and he did later sell it. In 1863, the Chinese had recently erected a wooden chapel. Now, the current chapel was built in 1874 from money from the lava beds, which I need to get into soon. It was a wooden building before that. Across the street was a very large Josh house. And later on, I'll point out a picture, which I believe, because there's no pictures that really exist of that, a picture that shows what I believe is the Josh house, okay? So the Chinese, I believe, had crept up and around to the end of Broderick Street, and the merchants were coming this way and building buildings and renting them out to Chinese and stuff like that. So it was kind of both in that area. Now, a lot of those buildings later, brick buildings, got sold. Two Chinese, Fong Li's building was sold in 1886 by Joseph Brock for $2,500 or $1,500. Anyway, this, in a way, this was a perfect storm because of this. When they couldn't get the river boats up here, Oroville said, okay, plan B, we're going to have a railroad. And one of the first railroads up here ran from Oroville to Marysville, so they could transport freight up and get it directly here, and they didn't have to go to Marysville. Well, they did initially. By 1870, that railroad reached Sacramento. So all of a sudden now you have it's a small train, I'll show it to you. You have transportation that you could have someone from Marysville to Oroville in an hour or less, and you just got on a train. That had implications in what we're going to talk about next with the lava beds, when the gold rush of the lava beds started. Okay? But this was a big deal, and Marysville was upset about that too, because it started taking income away from them, because now it could be transported all the way to Oroville, and Marysville didn't get a cut. Fires were a constant problem. This is a typical fire brigade from before 1870. This is how you fought a fire. You put in hose carts with 400 or 500 feet of hose, and you got the local firemen to pull it. Now, notice all these rocks and mud. They didn't get anywhere fast, because you can see how many people they're using to try and pull it, to get it through that. So this was the early version of the fire department, you know. And there was a number of carts on Montgomery Street, and later in 1910 there was one in Chinatown next to the Gee store, which we'll talk about later.
What did they connect the hose to?
They brought a ditch from the river into Oroville. They laid pipe and hooked that ditch into that pipe, these hydrants. So there would be and you were using gravity basically to do this. But basically you'd have a hydrant would have one spin-off, and they could bring that hose up. There was 2 of those in Chinatown. There was 3 of them on Montgomery Street. You could bring one, and there was one on Birch Street. You could bring those up, hook it up to the hydrant, and you got a stream. I don't know how far it shot, you know, but you got a stream of water, and that's how they were putting. You know, otherwise, you had to do a bucket brigade or something like that. Okay. But anyway, so it was 1870s before a real serious fire equipment came into being. This is the train that's going. Now, this train was done this picture is in 1870, and it was actually coming from Sacramento to Marysville and then on to Oroville in the 1870s. It had a freight car, a passenger car, and an engine. You know, and it ran on a daily schedule. In 1867, a new church was built in the form of a schoolhouse. This later became what was known as the Chinese mission in Chinatown. That was built in 1867. So now you've got right there, you've got the temple here, this Josh House, which we're going to look at a picture later, and this building. There was 3 buildings all surrounded right in that one little area. When they were building this, their storm came up, and they lost it, and they had to rebuild the whole thing. It took them a month and a half to rebuild the whole thing. They could do things quickly. So this is Broderick Street in 1872. This is the first original map of Oroville. Most early land deeds refer to these numbers. These are lot numbers. And they'll say on Broderick Street, lot 23, on Broderick Street, 88, etc. Okay? What you don't see here, this is all open land. This is the temple, today's temple. This is open land. This is all open land over here. So it was a relatively short street from the get-go. You know, Broderick Street did extend a little farther, but that ditch I was telling you about started coming down and came up Stafford Street for a ways, and so it kind of cut off the growth back. Now that's not, you could get from here to the lava beds. And there actually were parades sometimes from Chinatown to the lava beds. You know, so they were connected. But the lava beds in numbers at this point in time far exceeded what the numbers were up here. I think I have a slide that talked about it. 1870s mining started to change. Hydraulic mining was looked at. It came into being. Other forms of tunneling and digging and building, and with fancy pumps, you could dig deep holes and get the water out. And so mining really changed. Oroville's population itself decreased in the 1870s because the local miner who was there, and in fact, by that time, most of them had left because they'd gone farther up north into Cherokee and other areas that are farther up Highway 70. So the population of Oroville, once it had grown to a point, which was about 4,000 or 5,000 people, stopped, and it didn't really proceed. So the people on, if you look at that previous map, on this side, on the Oroville side of the river, there had been a number of whites who had been mining the river. And in one case, a gentleman had land and he sold it to a Chinaman for, I forget, I think it was $800, and he gave him 40 of those pans that he'd been using. They weren't doing that anymore. It was considered passé, that type of mining, except it's more or less a small income for an individual. So 1870s mining started to change, okay? However, the Chinese down at Rancheria and across the street, what would later become the lava beds, which is where, by the way, Kmart is now. The Chinese had discovered something that most people didn't know. If you look at the topography around Oroville, like Table Mountain, you see those big lava flows. This was an old river, an old lake. There was a volcanic eruption. Some think it was Lassen, some think it was up at Susanville, because there was a large volcano up at Susanville that you can hardly tell was ever there. By the way, Lassen is 1/3 of the size it used to be. But anyway, so the lava would flow into the rivers and form and solidify even underwater, and it built a cap. So the lava caps are what you see on Table Mountain. You'll see it when you're going between Chico and Oroville and all these little hills, and there's a little cap of lava on them. That was the original riverbed. We are right now standing in what then would have been about 200 feet of mud, because this is all eroded since then, okay? What that meant, or what it turned out, is all that area by Walmart and along Highway 70, if you dig down about 10 feet, you'll hit a lava. Lava stopped the flow of gold. It would sink to a pot when the water was running, a point where the water was running, where it hit lava and it would stop. A lot of people say the lava beds was named because someone mined up at Lassen, and he said it looks like the lava beds up in Lassen. There's actually a report I found where they admitted they were digging down 10 or 15 feet and hitting lava, and they found gold. No one else had thought of doing that. And so immediately, and this is where, like I said initially, the Guangdong area, most of those people did not have experience with mining. And actually, Darlene was kind enough to share this information with me. And I kept wondering, how did they buy up all that property? They either bought it or they leased it. And it was sold willingly by the people who had land there, because they thought a lot was worth $100 and they were giving them $300. One guy said was going to sell off his land. He said he was going to get $2,500 for it down there. So they were buying money, and everybody's going, "Whoa, this is great." What they didn't know was that whole area, 10 feet down, is where gold is. The Chinese knew. This is a coup. They really scored a coup with this. They knew because they'd had experience down there. They knew they could dig a hole 10 or 15 feet and start finding gold. Well, at that time, no one else was doing that. Like I said, that was passé, that type of mining. It got out, and an avalanche of Chinese started showing up down in the lava beds. Okay, they acquired almost all the land down there. It was 2 miles wide by 3 miles long. They either acquired it or they had a lease on it. They went in there and they were digging holes all over the place. And they brought out, and the population in the lava beds before October of 1874, grew to 8,000 Chinese. That's where the number, remember I said in the beginning, I kept hearing about 10,000 Chinese and I could not figure out that's not possible on Broderick Street. They weren't on Broderick Street. They were in the lava beds. The lava beds had their own little church and their own little community, and they had 2 or 3 stores down there. Fong Li had a store there in 1875, I know. So they were their own community. What happened was now the output from the lava beds was phenomenal. It was almost 1/3 of what Cherokee was producing in 1874 when they were blowing away the mountain with hydraulic mining. So it was a sudden influx of money into Oroville from the Chinese miners at the lava beds. They used that money to build that church in brick when it burned down in 1874. There's actually, if you go into the main altar room, there's a panel on that thing that's from Chinese miners to the church, to the temple. It was hand carved, and it's the top panel as you walk in the building that you walk up to that. I don't know what I want to call it. I won't call it a podium, but anyway, the top panel is hand carved and delivered from the lava beds to the temple. So the lava beds actually financed, and all of a sudden, a lot. And all of a sudden, in Chinatown, they started building nice houses. Some of them were 2 stories tall and stuff, and the whole level of Chinatown started to pick up. And it was noted in the papers, that this was happening. However, remember fires? They had fires after that, and most of it was lost. The temple, the wooden temple was lost. And so anyway, the Chinatown's appearance would kind of do this. New people would come in with money, fire. They leave. Other people were there. They built small shacks because they wanted a place to live and mine or earn a living. And so the level changed it fluctuated quite a bit. Okay. Mining along the riverbeds was almost non-existent by the mid-1870s. Okay. And this talks more about their experience. So let's go to the next one. By 1874, people from Oroville started putting in the papers, "Stop selling your land to the Chinese." Because they said we can dredge that land and use dredgers and automate the process. Well, nobody who had the land was familiar with dredging, and it really wasn't that popular then. And they pleaded with them, please do not sell any more land to the Chinese. But it was too late. They were, originally when they came over, they'd been making maybe $1.50 a day, and they were making $2.50 and up after that. Ironically, in July of 1873, San Francisco reported that the trains were adding more cars to accommodate the Chinese moving to other states because of harassment. I can't remember the exact population at this time in Chinatown in San Francisco, but it was up in the 20,000s or something like that. They were running into this anti-Chinese sentiment. And that really is where that started. And so some of the Chinese were leaving and moving to other states because the opportunities were better for them. Okay? By 1873, there was some conflict in Oroville because some Chinese were attacking the tax collectors. You got to remember now they got 8,000, well, that's just 70. Yeah, they got, by that time, they probably had about 5,000. And these guys are coming. They'd send 3 people out there and say, I need $4 and I'll give you this it was a little slip of paper about this thing for this month. And they were doing it. Well, finally they said, no, we're not doing it. And they started to rebel. It did make the papers. It didn't necessarily stop it, but it was notable that there was a resistance. Now, I mentioned earlier, I started to say this and I forgot. The original miners came over were not necessarily that knowledgeable about mining. There was another group of Chinese, and I don't remember all of this, that came over later from another area of China who actually came from mining communities. And they came into California, and they started organizing the Chinese more and showing them how to mine. Prior to that, some of the Chinese actually hired white foremen to help them manage their mining operation because they didn't have the experience to do it. So, but anyway, but I suspect this came about because they were getting more organized down there. They were emboldened, and they decided enough's enough. I'm not sure I can blame them. This is where I talked about the large brick stores. There was actually one built down in the lava beds during this time. In 1873, it was reported 700, 800 Chinese were reaching Oroville a month. Okay. They had also added a car on the train from Sacramento that we showed earlier to bring people into Oroville. Now, interestingly enough, Marysville in the 1870s reported a drop in population of Chinese. That's because they were here. There was articles saying they're coming out of the hills, they're coming on the train, they're coming by stage, they're coming, you know, because they had 8,000 of them, and there's 4,200 people in Oroville, or even not even that, probably 2,500 at that time. They were outnumbered like 4 to 1, and they freaked out. So.
Were these fires set, or were these accidental fires?
Okay, if you look at the history of the fires, there was always fires. And one of the reasons there were fires, and one thing that they did different in Chinatown than they did in downtown Oroville. In 1858, there was a huge fire in Oroville, and it wiped out most of the downtown. They immediately said, rebuild, but rebuild with brick. Okay? The difference between Chinatown and Oroville was Oroville's business section was here, and their residents were over here. So they didn't build brick houses, they built wooden houses, but they built brick stores. The Chinese used a different approach. They'd use a brick building for their store or buy it, build it or buy it, and they'd build wooden housing behind it, up against it. So what happened, you had a higher mix of wooden structures with brick structures in a condensed area than you did in downtown Oroville. And that was when people started saying Chinatown's a risk to the area because of the fires. In the 70s, I think they had 7 fires, something like that. You know, and funny, by the 30s, they weren't having many fires at all. There was an article appeared that I read where in Chico there was a fire, and how'd they word it? They said that it appears that some incendiary is running around starting fires in Chico, in Chinatown. So there were, I don't know that every fire was that way just because of the way they were the clustered and everything, but yes, there's strong evidence that fires were being set in Chinatown. This is the building of the wooden chapel. In 1874, on that map, I should have pointed it out, I didn't. That 1860 map, there was Oroville expanded, like I said, kind of more towards 70. And they had laid out a plaza for that area, so that the lots around it had an area that could be used for a park or whatever. Well, what happened was someone sold the lot to Chinese. So the Chinese were digging up the plaza of the new, and a lot of the lots, because people were selling it to them. They weren't stealing it. Yeah, oh, give me $200, you can have it. I mean, everybody was trying to make money. And so they were legitimately selling them the lots, and they started digging up the lots. And that's when this came up about the concern, you know, about the Chinese digging up the main area. In 1874, in October, there was an outbreak of malaria in lava beds. Remember I said the population was about 8,000? It was written up in a scientific journal, and that's where that number comes from. There was an outbreak of malaria, and it freaked everybody out. 200 Chinese died, 5,000 left the area, and that's when the population dropped back down to 3,000 in the lava beds. So, and that's kind of where it hung until the end of 1881, when basically the lava beds played out. And what happened, and what you'll see today if you go down there, is you'll see piles of rocks. What happened was businessmen in Oroville bought the property back in Chinatown, and they tried to go in and dredge it, thinking they would make a fortune because there's so much gold would come out of here. Turns out they were pretty thorough, and there wasn't a lot of gold left. So anyway, the piles of rocks you see now are from when they dredged it in 1881, 1882. Okay. Then they went back and smoothed it back out, trying to sell it as agricultural land, but it was pretty rocky. And that's why it was slow to develop. Okay. The hook and ladder company, they didn't have paid people working at the fire departments. They were volunteers. They started developing more paid personnel in the 70s. The lava beds, this is the lava beds. That's what I was talking about. You see all these piles of rocks. That's from the dredging. I didn't put a picture in here, I should have. Before they dredged it, the whole area was honeycombed with holes. Okay? What happened is when they abandoned it, there's a thing called a tobacco plant. It has like a yellow flower on it. They grew up in these holes because it was like a natural planter, and the gravel had been removed out of it. And they said the whole area down there had all these tobacco trees, and some of them came to 3rd Street. And they said it's really beautiful down there. But anyway, the cemetery. The cemetery is still there. I don't know, how many people even know the cemetery exists? Oh, good. It's not, now you're all gonna know. I have some concerns with the marker, because I don't believe, this says in the 1850s this cemetery was established. I think it was probably established in 1855, 56, when there were a number of Chinese here. I don't think there were that many here in 1850 to do that. But anyway, now the thing about it, I went over there and was talking to some friends about the cemetery, and the guy next door, there's a business on each side of it. There's no headstones in there. And the reason is the Chinese the goal of the Chinese was to go back home when they passed away. It was not to stay in California, okay? So what they would do is they would bury them, and then they would later remove them and take the bones and send them back, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, and take the bones and send them back to be buried with the family. So this cemetery was kind of a holding cemetery. It wasn't a permanent cemetery, But there had to have been, based on the numbers there, several thousand. Yeah?
I also know that because the Chinese, when they died, they wear a lot of jewelry too. So thieves would come into the cemetery and they would dredge it up. And so there were some markers there before, but they've all been.
There's a few, I didn't show it here, there's a few bricks embedded in cement in the back corner of that have Chinese writing on them too, that apparently when they were when the city went in and rebuilt the walls and everything, they cast them in cement. There's maybe 12 of them or so.
We have family members.
Yeah. Now, remember, you had to have money to send your relatives' remains back to China. There were several prostitutes buried in that cemetery too. And I had heard that they may not have ever been removed because no one had the money to send or the desire to send them back to China. I still think there's some bodies in that cemetery. You know.
They need some markers then.
It's possibly. I couldn't tell. I would love to have somebody who could read that stuff, look at some of this stuff and help me, but so the other thing that I thought was interesting I found out about was they would take food at the gravesite and leave it as an offering to who?
Your ancestors.
Okay, your ancestors.
And trips to wherever they're going, that's, burn money.
Right.
That's like you're giving them money, but you're burning paper money.
Right.
And it's like giving them money.
So I heard stories that when they were doing this, there were people who were gathering outside the cemetery waiting for them to leave so they could eat the food. There was one reference to it in an early article. Yeah. But anyway, the cemetery, what I was going to tell you was the guy next door, when I was talking to these people, we were standing there, and he goes, why is this here? There's no gravestones or anything. Why is this considered a cemetery? And why is it even here today? And I explained to him what we just talked about. And he goes, I've often wondered about that. So there's a lot of lack of knowledge about what was happening in the area. And there's still a lot of it today. Hopefully some of this will alleviate some of that. The 1880s, I mean, mining was declining at the lava beds because it was playing out, as I said, and people from Oroville bought back. In some cases, the original landowner still owned it because he only leased it. But people were buying back the other land to try and dredge it. Okay. The anti-Chinese movement kind of started to take off in 1880. And actually, it was reported north of here. I think it was in Weaverville. There was an article in the paper about something they were doing up there to make it difficult for the Chinese to stay in Weaverville. Okay? It ran in the Chico paper, and they said once that knowledge becomes common here, we think people in Chico will do the same thing. But it actually originated up north. It originated in San Francisco too, but up in Northern California, it was up north. And it took on a couple of forms. There's, it was meant to, what it did is it curtailed new people coming in to California. Some decided to leave, but I saw an article in 10 years, the Chinese population in California declined by 10,000 people. So it wasn't huge. But they also did things like they made it harder for women to come in, which was probably very stupid because one of the reasons Oroville progressed was not the men. The men did not say, we need a nice new street, we need a fancy house. It was the women who were pushing the men to do that. You didn't have that influence as much in the Chinese community because a lot of the men were still single. So in a way, it dissuaded, it was, I think, counterproductive myself to what they wanted to accomplish. You know, I think they should have instead encouraged people to have families and to take pride in their community and develop their own communities. And that's just my opinion, but that's the impression I got from reading it. Those laws, the anti-Chinese laws, went way up into the 1940s. They were rewritten and written. The Chinese could not have citizenship in California, I'm not sure about nationwide, until almost the 1940s. Okay? That's a throwback to the 1850s when California has conventions to issue its proclamation for the state of California. They had a vigorous debate about who was going to be a citizen of California. They said, okay, and they said citizens will have the right to vote. And they said, okay. And this debate went on for over a week. And they said, great, so Indians will have the right to vote because they were here before us. Not exactly. And they were arguing about this. They also said blacks will not have the right to vote. So this started back in the 1850s, this conversation about who was going to help govern the state or participate in voting. And basically what they finally reached an impasse. They said, all right, we'll agree to this initially. And the argument was they can't read and they can't write, so they can't vote. That was the debate. They said, you can't vote if you can't read and write, so we can't let those people vote, okay? And they said, okay, and they signed the Constitution or whatever it is for California, but they agreed to review this in 10 years because more of them might be able to read and write. That never happened. And so it's an early thing that was started in California about who was going to control what. The Chinese were not allowed citizenship. Early on, there was restrictions as to the Indians. They said could complain about someone harassing them, but they couldn't appear in court. They didn't want them in court. They could find someone else to represent them. And the Chinese, they sort of restricted what they could do too, as far as legally. So this law changed like 12 times in a matter of 15 years. So, but remember, I was talking about, this is a classic case of how you present one side of a story. The papers, the Oroville papers started to pick up on the anti-Chinese movement. Now, their editorials were saying, it looks bad, it's all wooden, it's a fire trap, there's brothels, da-da. The real reason they were doing it was about jobs. They had gone around and solicited various people in the town to try and sign on to a proclamation saying they would not hire Chinese or employ them. They couldn't get the people who were in Oroville and had Chinese working for them wouldn't sign. The merchants signed, and all of a sudden the ads started saying, we do not employ Chinese. However, kind of like today, we need the labor, and it's cheap labor, and so it fell apart. They basically started reneging on all these promises, and they weren't kicking forcing the Chinese to leave. Now keep in mind, there's a long history between the businessmen in Oroville and the Chinese. In Weaverville, they had 200 or 300 Chinese. $4 a month wasn't a big deal up there. Down here, it was a huge deal. And so the incentive for Oroville was basically to ignore it. What happened is Dogtown, which is now Magalia, put out an editorial and said everybody should ban shopping in Oroville because Oroville is doing nothing to try and drive the Chinese out of Oroville. So this is where the contradictions come in. You have this rhetoric, and the rhetoric changed. The jobs thing was kind of behind the scenes, but then it changed to, well, there's a lot of brick buildings, they have a lot of fires, which was true. If you look with the levee, which they put the levee in 1907 after a flood, and that's when the Chinese Museum flooded. The levee was viewed as a tourist attraction. You could walk along the elevated river and look on the levee and stop and eat lunch. But if you look this way, you looked at the river. If you look this way, you look to the back of Chinatown. And so editorials started showing up saying, well, we really need to clean up Chinatown because it's unsightly. Now, keep in mind, people are leaving soon after this. In general, the population's dropping in Oroville because the mining was playing out. You know, but nothing ever happened the whole time. There was never any. There was some policing in Chinatown, but there was policing other parts of Oroville too, and they were raiding Chinese businesses for, not having, or for making illicit whiskey or whatever, playing card games that weren't allowed. Only certain card games were allowed. And so there was that effort. Interestingly enough, when they reported it, they said, and they raised $300 in fines for the community. That's how it got reported. They would fine them and let them go, and they would talk about how much money they made from doing the raid. I mean, it was all about money. Everything was about money, And so you had this, for a long time, anti-Chinese movement, and in Chico and other places, they actually did force them out. In Oroville, yeah.
And didn't the women employ Chinese cooks and Chinese laundrymen, and didn't they object to tossing the Chinese out? I would think they would.
Didn't they object to what?
Tossing the Chinese.
Oh, yeah. People, Judge Lott had Chinese employees, and they loved their employees. I mean, I don't mean that. I mean, they were part of the family, Interestingly enough, just a side story. Just before this, an ad appeared in the Chico paper about saying we need to regulate the laundries. And there he goes, in Chinatown. Okay. The reason we need to regulate the laundries in Chinatown is they don't charge enough. We want them to raise the rates, and maybe more white women will move to Oroville, and they can be employed in the laundries, and we can find wives. That was the reasoning for doing that. It's a very contradicting at times relationship, but overall, Oroville's Chinese population didn't really drop till a little bit later. Fong Li, let's talk about Fong Li. Fong Li, actually, I found an article in 1875 where his store burned, and he'd given money, $700, to one of his friends, Chinese friends, and the Chinese friend later said he lost the money. And so Fong Li was very upset. Okay? His store did burn in the lava beds. There was another one who is also a very successful businessman, which is Hai Loi. And I actually believe he's in this picture. But anyway, Fong Li, when the lava beds played out, he says, okay, I'm going to move up to Broderick Street was called Upper Chinatown. I'm going to move up to Upper Chinatown. He bought, there was actually 3 Fong Li stores. This was the second one. He bought a 2-story building from Brock, opened up his store in 1886, and he paid, I think it was $1,500. Did I put it up there? $1,500 for it. It burned down in '93, and he rebuilt this store. This burned down in 1905 after his death, and it was rebuilt to the building that's now on Lincoln Street. So there was actually 3 different buildings. I always thought there was only 2, but after looking at deeds, I discovered there was 3.
What's the building currently called?
What? I didn't hear the question.
What the building is called, the current building.
It was sold in the 90s, I guess, and now it's actually a halfway house that's operated out of there. Yeah. Was it?
Women and Children Shelter.
Is that what it originally was? Because now it's not. Yeah, but now it's not. Yeah. 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 The Chan family that's here are descendants of Fong Li. Okay. And I believe, maybe you know, isn't this the Chan family flag? That's what I thought. It's in the temple, and it's yellow, right? Okay. Yeah. Fong Li was a very influential person because he got to know a few people. And Fong Li was the official employment office for Chinese in Chinatown, and the people who took advantage of that were people who were involved with mining. They would hire 100 or 200 Chinese to build a lot of the ditches and stuff that was done around here. So he had a store, but he was also an employment office. You know, he was very influential. Let's go to this. I clipped this headshot in that first one. This is Fong Li, Frank McLaughlin. McLaughlin was a wheeler and dealer in Oroville area. He built the China Wall, which was over by where the fish hatchery is. Diverted all the water. Thought they were going to get rich by going through there and picking up the gold. Didn't work out. Rocks were the size of cars. He built the Big Bend Tunnel. They dug a tunnel through Big Bend to divert all the water around Big Bend so they could go in here and mine all this riverbed that had been mined in the 1850s. Bust. He contacted a patent medicine man by the name of Pierce who invested $2 million in that tunnel, and he lost it. Now, Pierce had already made $5 million by the time he made that investment, so he didn't suffer a lot. But anyway, that's how much money patent medicine men had. This person is Charles Duell, I guess. I don't know how you pronounce it. This person was Fong Li's book keeper. Treva and I have been trying to understand, because this person was listed when this was made. On the back of the photo, a gentleman by the name of Parker who actually helped get people interested in saving the temple, and he also founded this organization. Anyway, he put unknown. We're pretty sure that's probably who that is, because he was very influential in the area. Jim Weldon was identified on the photo. Albert Foster Jones, this guy, was a big investor in the area and involved with a lot of things. High-low, what happened was, there wasn't a lot about this dinner in the Oroville papers, but in Santa Cruz, where he had built a house, they put out a 3-column thing about this dinner. And he mentions Hai Loi was there. And they were good friends at the lava beds. Hai Loi, I have actually seen referred to in one case as the mayor of the lava beds. Okay. He later moved also to Broderick Street and had a store there. I believe this person is probably Hai Lo, because he would have been close in the picture because they were very close friends. He was also a prominent businessman in Chinatown. I can't prove it, but I really think that's who they were, because he was at the dinner. That was in the article. Okay. In 1890, the Chinese population was down to about 900. After the 1907 flood, they built the levee that exists today that goes down along Broderick Street. They actually had a meeting with the local Chinese and basically approached them and said, if you'll deed us the property to a portion of your land, we'll put a levee up and it'll avoid flooding. And they actually did. The Chinese actually met and decided to deed a portion of their property to Oroville so they could put the levee in. So a lot of the lots are shorter than they were, especially around the temple area and stuff like that. Yeah. 1910, the Tong Wars hit Oroville. Now, this stuff was generated in San Francisco, and there was a large Chinese population in San Francisco. And I'll stick myself on a limb and say, this was kind of a variation of the Chinese mafia. I mean, of the Italian mafia. What they did, I found a first-hand account by a black lady that lived in Chinatown, where she was talking about them, and she said, we knew 2 weeks before this was going to happen that the Tong were coming to Oroville. So all the women would leave and take whatever possessions they valued with them. Then, after the Tongs left, and usually they came in and they disturbed things a lot, and they ransacked houses and stuff. And after they left, we were notified we could come back, and we'd come back. So they might be gone for a month during this period. So it was not a surprise attack or anything like that, you know. But there are warring factions in Chinatown that were trying to control certain parts of business. Some were prostitution, some were liquor, some were this, but they were warring. That overflowed into this area because there were some relatives to them in a lot of these little towns. So it's made the papers a lot. And they actually the police actually sent people downtown, Chinatown, to parole the streets at nights because of it. And this went on between 1910 and about 1921, I could tell. Let me go, one last thing. In 1910, they actually contacted the Tongs, asked them to come out to Oroville, and they negotiated in advance, because what they would do is after they ramshackled the place, they would say, if you pay us money, we'll make sure this doesn't happen again. They actually contacted them in advance, had them come out, they met in the Chinese temple, and they negotiated that if the merchants of Oroville paid them $2,500, there wouldn't be a Tong War in Oroville that year. So, and that actually was negotiated. It actually was by the member of the Gee family who was part of that. Fong Li, by the way, Fong Li died, and Fong Li was not his original name. And I don't totally understand this. Huh?
Can I explain it?
Sure.
Fong Li, the Chinese characters means big profit. So, you know, Chinese like to say, you name your store after something really nice. So it's named after, it's big profit. It's actually what the Chinese character is. His name is Chin Fong Yu. So that's where you get the Chan. Chan and the Chin Chinese name. That's why his name is Chin Fong Yu. So when you hear about the Chan family, it's because that's his real surname. He's actually Chan or Chen.
And then
People would go visit him in his merchant in his store, so they just called him Fong Li, you know, by their name, you know, like, some of the stores that we would have. And then it carried down not only from my great-grandfather, but also grandfather, so he became Fong Li. So it becomes complicated because sometimes when I'm looking at history, I'm like, wait, great-grandfather died already, but it must be grandfather, because it's still carried down the name.
right. They basically were taking the name of their store and using that.
He's not really a Fong, and he's not really a Li, which is also a Chinese surname. So I don't want to confuse you, but you confuse me. But,
Yeah.
I actually see the character.
I've tried to do some Chinese ancestry work, and it's tricky. You know, but anyway, I do try and look up the history of most of the people that I talk about in Ancestry.com, and I create trees for them. Okay, because the people are really what this is about. You know. So anyway, until 1921, the Tong Wars got a lot of press in Oroville. That started to agitate people in Oroville, and it had heightened this talk about we need to get rid of Chinatown, okay? But the death knell, and during the same period, these Chinese parades, and this is a bomb festival, they still have it in Marysville. I don't know when the last one was in Oroville. This is from 1907. Now, this is supposed to be the Chinese theater, which means the mission, or the temple, is back behind on the other street, back behind this building on the other side of the street. This, I believe, was the other Josh house that was destroyed shortly after this because it got flooded and it collapsed. That's the only picture I've seen. I have seen another picture looking down after the flood. Somebody was standing where the levee was, and they shot back towards the temple. And you can see two things. You can see the little mission, and then you see these things sticking up on the other side of them, which is where the other Josh house would have been. So there was actually two. This was actually considered an area where they set off fireworks. It's kind of, if you're at the mission or at the temple and you turn around like you're leaving, it's off to the left a little bit. You'll see a marker that unfortunately has been vandalized with nothing on it. That's where the mission was. The Chinese temple was in between the Chinese theater was in between the temple and the next house down. We'll look at a map real quick. I'm running late, so I want to get out of here because I know you're getting tired. 1906, big scandal. Someone accused the police force of taking money. They were shaking down people in Chinese, and if you give me for a prostitute, it was 50 cents a week. If it was a gambling house, maybe a buck and a half, and we'll keep you safe. It actually went into trial. Took on a while. They didn't find anybody guilty, but the 4 officers involved were never seen again. So there's all kinds of facets to this story. It's kind of amazing. This is the temple. Again, I colorized this. This is the temple after the flood. This is the contents of the temple as it was being set out. A gentleman by the name of, I can't remember his first name, Parker, like I mentioned before, who was very interested and instrumental in trying to get this saved, because he went to the different ladies' organizations in town and made a spiel, and it started to catch on. Now, and you might help me with this. My understanding is that the Chan family was asked to safeguard these items from the temple.
My grandmother, when it happened in 1907, they just lived down the street from the temple. So she just went down there, grabbed them all, and she opened a bank at the time. My father said it was Bank of America, and they put them in a vault.
Okay.
Until she told them, until the city of Oroville built the temple, which exists now, and the temple tapestry room there, and then she gave them back. And my dad said, yeah, and she didn't even charge him, interest because of the vault. But that's mostly what she did.
And that part of it does correspond with what Parker said when I heard an interview with him before he passed away. And he was talking about that the Chans were going to take care of this stuff, and they were going to try and restore the temple, and raise money to do that by the city. And that didn't happen until 36 or 45 or something. This is other areas where damage was in. This supposedly is a Fong Li store. You can see all the mud up against the thing. I'm not convinced that's a Fong Li store, but it's in Chinatown.
And this is before the levee was built?
Before the levee was built. The levee was built the following year after this happened. It was built at one height, and in 48, it was raised another 5 feet or something like that. This is downtown. This is a Sanborn map. Sanborn maps, unlike county maps, what they do is they're interested in whether they're insuring a brick building or a wooden building or what kind of structure. So they started color coding. All the red are brick. Okay? And this is Montgomery Street, and this is where the Ford dealership is, or was. So they would use this to help, and they also started putting the actual addresses of the building on the maps, which helps too, because you can now start to identify where 960 was or whatever, rather than it's lot 10, which was what the original way they did it. Okay? Let's look at this. This is where that Josh house was. It was gone by 1909. This is where the Chinese mission location was, and it was damaged in the flood, and it was rebuilt. This is the Chinese temple. This is the theater. It was a wooden structure. Everything in yellow is wood. Everything in pink is brick. You'll see what I was talking about, how the brick buildings were surrounded by wooden buildings. So that's a higher risk of fire than if the brick buildings were in here and all the people lived over there. You know, it's just the nature of the beast. This is the Fong Li store.
Was that the Eman home before?
Huh?
That became the Eman home later?
No, the Eamon home's down. It's down here. This is Broderick Street. This is the river's right here.
Oh,
Okay? All right. And so this, in 1908, 1908, it was actually thriving because people were moving out of other Chinese communities in California, and some of them came to Oroville. So it was a pretty thriving community at this time. You know, they did have fire hydrants finally. The street was still dirt. But natural elements started to take out things. It was torn down in 1929 because it was practically falling over. The population, another map we'll look at, was very small in Chinatown by that time. This house, if you've read the papers recently, the Hmong have moved into a building in Chinatown. That's the building.
That wasn't a house that's the Chinese Masonic one.
Pardon?
Chinese Masonic Lodge.
It was, I think it's right here. This building still exists because the Hmong are going to use it. This building still exists. That's the one that's still standing, and this building still exists. And that's what you see is this, and this when you go to Broderick Street now. This was all gone for the most part by 1926. Okay. Even Montgomery Street and stuff wasn't, you know, there was still a lot of land. This piece of land here, which was known as, I think, Block 2, a gentleman who had one of these brick buildings and a businessman, and he was using it. There were several businessmen running. One was a cigar store. He actually made the cigars in Chinatown using Chinese help. He decided to sell all this to the Chinese temple for $10, I believe, or something like that. And he deeded all this property to them so they would have more property. So there were people that were friendly and sympathetic. You do see a lot of articles about people that are sympathetic to what was happening in Chinatown. Okay. We'll go, and there's another map shortly. This is Chinatown in 1910. This really was kind of the heyday. Okay, this is Broderick Street. This is Safford Street. This is, what would that be, an Oak, I guess. It comes right through here. Fong Li's place is down here. It's behind the photographer who took this. And it was a nice looking community. They had telephone poles, they had all the big trees and everything. It probably was the heyday of that area of Chinatown in 1910. And so, now let's go back to Guanglianggi. Am I doing it right? Close. Now, he also had a second name too, right? Wasn't there another version of his name that was used?
Yeah, that was his name.
Okay, all right. He was probably in the lava beds. He came into Chinatown in 1901. His wife was from Marysville. That's where she was born. And actually some of their children were born in Marysville too. He had a heart condition, so he passed away in 1911. She continued to operate the store until about 1932 in Chinatown. Now remember, this is the time when the Tong Wars are going on, the bootlegging's going on, all these things are going on in Chinatown, and she's running a store there. I told Darlene I actually think she's the hero of the family myself. But anyway, that's my opinion. Dr. Ling originally opened his practice, and I'm going to show you a picture of their house, or their store, in 1901 in the same place that they were operating, because that was a drugstore they were running. And he was practicing medicine. Chinese, what's interesting about, I find, the Chinese, all this stuff's going on about the Chinese and da-da-da-da. Yankee Hill had 4 Chinese doctors up there. Everything that was resort hired a Chinese doctor to work there. Chinese doctors were highly respected, and people in Oroville, and not just Oroville, in Yankee Hill and all over, were very aware of the Chinese doctors. You know, they were sure a lot more experienced than the people making those damn patent medicines. But this building has been vacant at this time, like 17 years or something like that. This was the front brick portion of the store that was the drugstore. I superimposed this sign on there. That sign still exists. It's in someone's private collection. I believe that's where it was, because it was a wooden sign. It wouldn't make sense to put it out here in the elements. But I did superimpose that. You can see there some of the wooden structures behind there, you know. This was torn down. It was one of the last buildings torn down, actually, in Chinatown, probably around 1953, I'm guessing. There's another version of this store, picture of it without all the overhang and everything. So there's a later picture of it beyond this. This is the site. This is the wall of the Bolt Museum. This is the site of their store. And Katie Carney, another black lady that lived in Chinatown, the same one that lived in Chinatown. Originally, she lived on the other side of them. I've seen a picture, Darlene has it, where this tree, the distance between this building and this building were looks like 10 or 15 feet tops, it seems like, and this tree is growing in between them. It's still there, and it's I call it a Chinese grapefruit tree because supposedly it's similar to a grapefruit, but a sweeter fruit. It's a pomelo, okay, Chinese pomelo tree. But am I correct that a lot of people think it's kind of like a grapefruit, but sweeter?
Our great-grandfather brought it up.
Yeah, he planted this when he started his store in 1901. So, and there's one more of these in the Chinese temple that I know of.
Larry, when I moved here in 1980, there were still 2 brick buildings there. I remember them tearing them down and me being upset because I knew they were Chinese buildings.
Mm-hmm. Are you sure it was this one's that close to the...
Well, it was right there just east of the Bolt Museum.
Okay. All right. Basically, what they did is they forfeited their property. When her children graduated, and the descendant, their grandfather, right? Not great-grandfather, grandfather. When they graduated from college, she shut down the store and moved to San Francisco, correct? Okay. So, but it took a lot of guts to do this during the period of time she was there. This is, 1920 was the death knell to Chinatown. Because what happened, a lot of the buildings had started to become abandoned, and basically new groups moved in, okay? New cultures, etc., moved in. Bootlegging took off. Now, bootlegging, there was a lot of money to be made in it, and the competition was much more stiff than it was between the Chinese. And it was even noted in the papers that the crime in Chinatown had taken a significant uptick when in the 20s from previous times. This area was called the Tenderloin. Okay? This is the building that's still standing. Katie Carney lived in it until 1975, Fong Lee's store. This was this was occupied by, what's her first name? Her last name's Jellison. Okay. She was considered the queen of prostitution in the 1920s. Yeah, Carrie Gelazone, I'm sorry. Carrie Gelazone ran this. Her husband, well, there's a story. Anyway, so this was being talked about what was going on in some of these areas. And I think even Katie, this only had 3 little rooms in it, but I think she also was running a little of that. She did confess she was doing bootlegging. Carrie Gelazone is an interesting character. She moved into Chinatown in 1921. She was black. There was about 6 blacks living in Chinatown during this period. And most of them, they were bootlegging, but it wasn't a big deal. This lady was something else. She had lived with her husband. He was in the logging business in Chinatown. She stabbed him 4 times. She went to jail, San Quentin, got out, came back. They didn't divorce. He stayed in one building and she moved into this building, into here. Okay? This is pretty wild. There's some wild stuff about it. She had a daughter. She got mad at her daughter one day and hit her in the face with a hot iron. She was way over the edge. The husband, the roofs needed repaired, some of them. She went to her husband, who she was still married to, but they weren't together, and said, I need you to fix the roof. And he said, I'm not paying to fix those roofs. You know, that's your problem. They've been separated now by this time by 6 or 7 years, even though they're in the same area. He then files for divorce the next month. She then shoots him the following month and killed him. She got sent to San Quentin and died there in 1955 for murder. So the level of crime, partially because of her, really escalated in Chinatown, and everybody's going, okay, we're done, stop, you know, and it really had a detrimental effect on the future of Chinatown. I have a picture of her, but I didn't put it up there. You know, but she's an unusual case. She was definitely not right in the head. This is 1926, another Sanborn map. Oh, this is gone, and this is what's left. This is their store, the Gee family's store, right here. Katie Gelazone was here for a while, or not Gelazone, Katie Carney was here, and then she moved over here. This burned down. This is still the area where Carrie Gelazone was. But you can see it's really, for the most purposes, by the middle of the 20s, it's gone. You can see in the ground footings for these, and I'm assuming there was some attempt to make a little shack that someone could live in. That's the only thing I can come up. I will tell you, in 1946, there was a movement in Butte County to develop housing for returning servicemen. And the county, the Oroville agreed to sell this property to the county if they could build temporary housing for servicemen. And that was actually done in place in 1948. You know. But Chinatown, for the most part, this was all gone within 3 years, 4 years. Looked mostly like it does today, because after this need for this house, this isn't the housing, but it was in the same locations. After the need for the housing, the government said they would tear the structures down when the housing crunch got solved for the servicemen. So it was temporary housing. There was it might be this one, there was a 6-story little apartment complex that was part of that too. So, all right, I'll try to get through this. Let's get done. 1938, everything's abandoned. Weeds, there just wasn't enough Chinese in the area to support it. In 1930, it really kicked up again about let's clean up Chinatown. And it was proposed that because the levee was such a great tourist attraction, that they should build baseball fields and parks and swimming pools in that area to complement what was going on top of the levee. It got a lot of traction, okay? And they rezoned, that's when they rezoned all the property to commercial, to leisure. We're almost done here. The temple was rebuilt in 48, opened, officially dedicated in 49. This is a picture of it in 1960. You notice there's no park here or anything like that. And these are the buildings that are still left. Sears Glass Company, this is the one that the Hmong are leasing. This was, Jellison actually lived here, Mr. Jellison. This was a wooden building before, so I'm not sure when this got built. But this is not original. Sears Glass went in and modified the building so that they could park trucks inside of it. Okay? This was added at some point. There was a building there before, but it was wood, and it burned down. Okay? This is the current Fong Lee building, the third one. This is where Katie Carney lived, across the street from the Bolt Tool Museum. This is probably the oldest building in Chinatown. Based on the masonry work, this is probably 1860s. So, what?
Brought this up.
Oh, okay. We're going to do a raffle here in just a second. I'm just about done. Oh, I am done.